Hi everyone, I want to welcome you to week 4 of Bioethics 400, Responsible Conduct of Research. And in this week we're going to be exploring issues of collaborative research and also continue our discussion of data ownership. Now this lecture itself will actually focus primarily on some of the challenges associated with collaborative research. Data ownership will come up, but we've talked a little bit about it in last week. We'll be touching upon it a little bit more next week when we talk about academia and industry partnerships. And a lot of the readings assigned to you this week go into issues of data ownership in great depth. So really what I want to focus on is collaborative research. Our learning objectives for this week include making sure that you understand the special responsibilities that arise when researchers such as yourselves work as partners on collaborative projects, either as the primary or principal investigator or PI, or as one of the co-investigators or student or technician working on these projects. Understand the fundamentals of a successful collaboration. What does it take to make sure that your scientific collaboration is going to be fruitful, and then finally to understand the expectations of data ownership and collaborative research. Again, this lecture will focus primarily on the first two learning objectives, and the third learning objective will largely be covered by the work that you do with the assigned readings as well as the learning activities for this week. All right, so what is collaborative research? Well, collaborative research, as it's defined by the U.S. Office of Research Integrity, are endeavors that take place between investigators, scholars, and researchers in which each of these individuals has an assigned role in conducting the research. Collaborations may be practical in nature, they usually are, but they may also be abstract in nature depending on the field in which you work in, and they may include sharing responsibility for establishing a theoretical direction of research. So you can have situations in which your collaborator actually does little to no bench work, does little to no actual collection or analysis of data, but is involved early on in the process in terms of developing the direction of the project, coming up with the theoretical frameworks, or even helping with the study design. Now, why is collaboration important? Most of you are probably well aware of this, but science is increasingly addressing more complex and challenging topics, and this often requires an interdisciplinary team of researchers and the use of a variety of theoretical and methodological approaches. None of us, even top-level Nobel laureate level researchers, have all of the skills that are necessary to do the work that is required for many of the research projects that we're pursuing. I myself am not well versed, for example, in some of the more robust biostatistical methods that my projects require. I understand the basics, but I can't do the data analysis myself. So instead, I collaborate with a biostatistician located here at Clarkson's Capital Region campus, and she runs all of the analyses for me. As a result of that, the quality of my research has improved because I've got an investigator from a different discipline who has a different perspective and a much better understanding of the statistical methods that are required. Finally, collaboration can help to improve your own expertise and skills by being exposed to these other disciplines, perspectives, and methods. Okay. Now, collaborations, we use the term rather broadly, and collaborations can actually vary greatly in size and scope. It can be something as simple as sharing a reagent or a technique with another colleague in the same department or university. So if your department has a weekly or monthly lab meeting, for example, where different investigators, different labs come together to share some of their research and findings. If you have someone who provides advice or input, that is, in a sense, a form of collaboration. Similarly, if you need to borrow an antibody or cell line from another lab, that is a form of collaboration. There are also multi-institutional clinical trials that involve several medical centers. You may also have, they might not be clinical trials, but they might be other multi-institutional research projects that involve several laboratories or agencies. And then finally, you have large international consortiums like the one that was involved in the Human Genome Project. That was led in the United States by the National Human Genome Research Institute and the Department of Energy. But they actually worked with a number of different groups around the country and in fact around the world to actually sequence the first draft of the human genome, all 3 billion DNA letters in the human genome. And then that was actually a project that, if you've ever seen the paper reporting that, actually lists over 100 authors on the paper alone, and that's because the International Human Genome Sequencing Consortium included hundreds of scientists at actually 20 different sequencing centers in China, France, Germany, Great Britain, Japan, and the United States. So depending on the scale of collaboration, you can have increasing complexity of the nature of the collaboration and increasing challenges in terms of setting up and running the collaboration. So what are the stages of collaboration? Well, collaborative science proceeds through a series of steps, and this includes conceptualization of the idea, proposal preparation and submission, project management, implementation and data collection, evaluation and data analysis, dissemination, and conclusion or continuation. So I just want to touch on each of those. So each of these stages represents only a single step in the collaborative research projects, but certain activities can extend through several stages and are considered interrelated. Moreover, I'd like to say that this is not a complete list of every possible stage, but really what I consider to be some of the important points. So in terms of conceptualization, in the very beginning, this is when you have an investigator who seeks input from the collaborators on the research goals, the specific measurable objectives, and the approaches to reach those goals or objectives. And a researcher's discipline and background will influence their assumptions about the nature of the research. Even researchers within the same discipline and working within the same setting, for example, the same institution, be it an academic institution, government agency, or a private industry lab, may not necessarily share the same assumptions given their exposure to different research experiences. Then you have the proposal preparation and submission process. This goes hand in hand in some ways with the conceptualization, but is going to be influenced by sort of the approvals required as well as the types of resources that need to be devoted to the research project itself. Project management involves setting up a general framework for overseeing the collaboration. And this framework allows for guiding each facet of the study from assessing the general philosophical ideas that lead to the design of the project itself, to detailed data collection and analysis methods. This requires the ability to organize participants and keep them on track, and also involves the allocation of resources, roles, and responsibilities. Usually there's a project manager, and that project manager, who's generally not the principal investigator or PI, it usually reports to them, but the project manager in some ways is accountable to everyone, both internal and external stakeholders. And so their role in the project is key, and particularly their ability to manage different aspects of the project and communicate between the different collaborators. This can also involve establishing agreements such as transfer of materials, ownership of data, etc., as well as determinations about control of budget and finance issues. Now, the researchers who are in charge overall must be able to understand the scope of the entire project, keep everyone on track, and schedule when to allocate resources appropriately. They also have to make sure that they are available to help all of the collaborators at the necessary time. And again, a lot of this involves the ability to communicate effectively. Communicating effectively requires the ability to address issues that come up quickly and succinctly, address issues around data storage and use, reliably send out critical information to everyone. You also need to have a single person who will sort out queries, refer to, and disseminate this sort of information. That may or may not be the project manager. You also need someone, again, who may or may not be the project manager, to arrange meetings and review of progress, particularly if there's any situation involving consideration of a project status, advances and impediments, etc. These meetings are important because they influence every aspect of the research, including future directions and whether or not to stop the research endeavor earlier than intended. Okay. Project management also needs to consider later steps, including how to collect and analyze data properly, because this allows for a single group to focus on a subset of analysis while another group looks at more broad general collection of data and interpretation. And it also needs consideration of how you're going to evaluate the knowledge claims being made in the research and the strategies for inquiring and driving procedures forward. So let's talk a little bit about implementation and data collection. Okay. Now, everyone involved in a collaboration is obligated to stick to the research protocol, stay on time, and communicate openly. And we'll talk a little bit later about what collaborators have to demonstrate in terms of their traits. Okay. Now, researchers in the study, and particularly the PIs, are counting on everyone to do their job on time and according to protocol in order to make sure that the project proceeds as expected. Delays, even minor ones, can disrupt the entire flow of a study, particularly if you've got multiple collaborators, multiple labs who are relying on one another for timely share of information. Therefore, it becomes very important to have effective communication and let people know of problems, issues, and delays as soon as they arise. Communicating openly also allows others to help if need be. Now, implementation and data collection also needs to have consideration of staff. So training of staff is going to depend on their level of experience to execute the chosen research procedures correctly. Some of the staff may have great experience, and some of the staff, particularly say a graduate student or an undergraduate student or a brand newly hired technician, may have little to no experience with the protocol. So collaboration needs to include what type of training is needed for these individuals, who does the training, how to measure the quality of the training, and any follow-up or remediation that is required. If collaborators can't agree on training, then there will be problems with ensuring research quality, and there may be potential damage to both the researchers and the organization's reputations. Finally, there's the consideration of collection of data. What data is being collected, how is it collected, how is it being stored, and who is responsible for gathering and storing this data. It also includes considerations of how the data will be shared and with and by whom. And depending on the nature of the collaborative relationship, who is assigned to actually handle the data collection, storage, and dissemination issues can vary. Now, collection of data in a collaborative endeavor also includes consideration of the ways in which to watch for variations from protocol, both variations from protocol by individual staff members within one site or variations from protocol between sites, particularly if different sites, say in a clinical trial involving multiple medical centers, different sites are doing the same procedure but on a different subset or population. So variations from protocol can actually affect the quality and comparative nature of the data. And sometimes, particularly with multi-site trials, this involves having site visits by the PI and sometimes the project manager to observe performance of the protocol, check lab notebooks, and to identify any unintentional lapses or even scientific misconduct that may arise. Evaluation and data analysis. Evaluation really involves two primary events. One, validating the research process, which is an ongoing obligation throughout the study, and two, reviewing and analyzing collected data. Validating the process, as I mentioned already, is done to ensure that the goals and benchmarks of the project are being met and to ensure conformity to the study protocol. Okay. You also have to be able to explain how the findings of research were found and analyzed. As you know from one of the assigned readings for this week, Shamu and Resnick, they write that, quote, to identify as an author or a collaborator, each person must be held accountable for the entire research project. This does not mean that each member is responsible for every part of the project, since different people may perform different tasks, but each person should be prepared to explain the project and defend it in public. Okay. Now, dissemination. Dissemination of findings, data, results requires that collaborators agree on a number of things, including the process for distributing information, who is the authorized spokesperson and contact, who is the target audience for dissemination of this information, are there any restrictions on what information will be shared or what data will be shared with others, and finally, authorship criteria and credit. We'll talk about authorship criteria and credit later in the course when we talk about publication and peer review. Now, there are different levels of dissemination. There is group internal dissemination. This is because sharing data within the group is important to reinforce trust and collegiality among the collaborators. And this can include such simple things as sharing lab meeting minutes, progress reports, protocol changes, and any raw and final data sets. Then there's outside dissemination. This is can vary, but most collaborative projects have some sort of obligation to report to the funding agency or grantor. You also have an obligation, where necessary, to share information with research participants, the media, and any regulatory agency that might have oversight authority. There has to be consideration of who will discuss information about the project at a conference, both as an invited formal talk or abstract, as well as the sharing of information among colleagues at that conference, what I like to call the sort of in the hallway conversations. There has to be consideration of publication in peer-reviewed journals, and finally you have to have some consideration of both the format and the content of the disseminated information. Finally, there is the conclusion or continuation phase. This actually can occur at any time during the process, during conceptualization, implementation, or after implementation, and depending on the goals of the research, the parameters may dictate that once a set point is reached, the collaboration ends or is modified to bring in others. Now, sometimes there are conflicts that arise between researchers that cannot be overcome, such as unmet deadlines, incompatible work styles, disagreements about staff, etc. And so sometimes that means that you will end a project before it reaches its logical conclusion, but that once again is the conclusion of the collaboration itself. Finally, research results can reveal unexpected findings that may cause collaborators to rethink the makeup of the collaboration or ending the collaboration altogether. And so there needs to be a discussion of what continuing needs to collaborators within the area of study, as well as exploring their desire to continue and the rationale and cost of continuing the collaboration. So I just want to pose to you a case study for you to think about. So you have Sharon, Ben, and Tara, and they meet during a late-night discussion at a professional meeting. They share a common interest in learning disorders, but they come from different scientific backgrounds. Sharon works at the cutting edge of brain imaging technology, whereas Ben is an educational psychologist interested in preschool children in inner cities. Finally, Tara has been putting together her knowledge as a physiologist to explore the effects of alternate medicines, particularly the effects of alternate medicines on kids' learning abilities. So as this late night discussion turns into early morning, this trio begins to see the benefits from working together and start sketching out a grant proposal that would explore the use of alternative medicines among preschool children in inner cities to improve their ability to learn. And Sharon will be involved by using brain imaging technology to look at any changes in these children's brains as these alternative medicine treatments are used. Okay, so they have a very good scientific idea that falls quickly into place, but there are a number of logistical questions that are raised that need answers. And so some questions that you need to consider even at this early in the stage include who should draft and submit the proposal. Okay? And if these investigators are at different institutions, which institution should be the lead institution in terms of submitting the proposal? Okay? Do all three of these individuals need to get IRB approval to work on the project, particularly since this is a project involving young children? What will happen if their work has practical applications? How should they go about answering these questions? And are there any other important questions that should be asked as well? So this is the very beginning of a collaboration. You can see that there are a number of very challenging issues and questions that arise. So I want to suggest that you maybe pause for a moment, stop this lecture, and really just consider sort of what you might do if you were in this situation of setting up this initial collaboration where you have a great idea and you need now to start working on a proposal as well as all of the other required elements to move that project forward. Okay. So essentially, what I've hoped I've sort of convinced you of is that effective collaboration is very tricky. And this is a great quote. It's the quote that states that collaboration is a major responsibility, one that is not to be entered lightly. It will take time, effort, and the nurturing of relationships. Okay? And that those relationships require that all of the collaborators involved in the collaboration demonstrate a number of traits, including honesty, openness, fairness, industriousness, respect, reliability, trust, cooperation, accountability, competence, and collegiality. I've lined these up so that some of them are actually related to their obvious counterpart. For example, honesty leads to trust and vice versa. So if you consider, for example, cooperation, working together requires cooperation. As I mentioned, the collaborators must share data, resources, and techniques. Trust is important. If the collaborators trust each other, then less conflicts are likely to arise. Trust is enabled by transparency and honesty, where each collaborator can see that the conduct of the others is not selfish or negligent. Part of this involves keeping others updated and involving them in any decisions, problems, or developments that arise for your part of the collaborative endeavor. Collegiality involves treating each other as equals and sharing responsibility as such, even when one of the collaborators is maybe involved only in a subset of the project or doing a limited data analysis, such as when I collaborate with my biostatistician colleague. I don't treat her as sort of a subordinate or someone I'm contracting with. Instead, I treat her as an equal and value her input not only on the statistical methods, but also on other aspects of the study design. Okay? So a way to think of collegiality is really respect. It's respect accorded to a friend or ally in pursuit of a common goal. And a collegial arrangement will make expectations of responsible conduct more apparent and the experience of collaborating more enjoyable. So there's fairness, okay? You need to treat all of the individual interests of the collaborators fairly and recognize and communicate about these interests to ensure that fair treatment can and does occur. Some items of particularly important consideration with regard to fairness are authorship, intellectual property rights, and division of labor. Okay. Competence enables work quality and wise decisions in a collaboration. Everyone is dependent on the competence of the other collaborators, and so you need to make sure that you identify not only competent collaborators, but that they're qualified to perform the delegated analyses and contribute to the work appropriately. Another one I always like to focus on is accountability. Collaborators, as I mentioned, have an obligation to account for their actions. This is enhanced by having a clear division of labor, as well as making sure that you have honest and open communication so that all collaborators are accountable to each other. Right? So these are just some of the different sorts of ways of ensuring effective collaboration. And again, I want to encourage you to kind of pause here and think about what these words mean to you, and for anyone that's actually been involved in a collaborative project as part of work that you've done in one of your undergraduate research labs. Think about when the people you've worked with have demonstrated these traits or have not demonstrated these traits, and how it affected the nature of the collaboration that you had with them. Okay. Now, you need to have, obviously, leadership. Leadership is always challenging, and it's really brought by the principal investigator or investigators. And the PI has to provide leadership with respect to clear expectations about the goals and responsibilities of the research team. And so that means that the PI really has to have a handle on the goals of the project and the anticipated outcomes, the role of each partner in the collaboration, again, how data will be collected, stored, and shared, how changes in research design will be made, who will be responsible for drafting publications, criteria to identify and rank authors, etc., etc., etc. And this even includes the decision about if and when to change or end a collaboration. You need to have a management plan that specifies a chain of command for important project components. There may even be a disagreement about who is the PI and what their responsibilities are. There may be different leaders for different components of the project. That's when you have this idea of principal investigators, that is the plural, or co-investigators who are responsible for some but not all components of the project. I have a large training grant from the Fogarty International Center, which is one of the institutes of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and that project is to conduct research ethics education in low and middle income countries in the Caribbean Basin. And I collaborate with two institutions, one at St. George's University in Grenada, and the other is the Autonomous University of Querétaro in Mexico. And at each of those sites, there is a local PI who is responsible for making sure that all of the training activities that are coordinated at those sites is done properly. Now, those individuals report to me, but I make sure to treat them as my co-investigators and equals, and really listen to any input that they have about challenges of providing this sort of education in their home institutions and home countries. So they report to me, but I am responsible for the overall management of the project. I am also responsible for managing the project budget and any audits of that. And I'm also responsible for ensuring compliance with applicable policies and regulations. But I rely on my PIs to follow my directions in that regard. You have to have adequate training and supervision. The PI is, again, responsible for that, and they need to establish a clear plan for training research team members for their respective responsibilities to the project, and this is particularly true for student contributors like yourselves. And we'll talk about sort of that trainee-mentor relationship a little later in this course. And this is because the PI is ultimately responsible for the work of all team members. So they're directly responsible for making sure that each team member is doing the work that they're supposed to. In some cases, however, depending on the size of the project and the number of collaborating sites involved, some of this responsibility is likely to be delegated to others with respect to training and supervision of staff. Finally, you have to have compliance with applicable policies and regulations. As the PI, you're the signatory person on the grant proposals, and you're also responsible for making sure that any applicable human subjects, animal subjects, and hazardous use restrictions and protocols are done. But each member of the research team nevertheless has to be knowledgeable and comply with the relevant policies and procedures. So as PI, you're responsible for providing the training and supervision to ensure that level of compliance. Okay? And so this is where an effective management plan becomes important. Management plan is essential for making a collaboration successful, and the management plan deals with issues that would most often be taken on by the principal investigator in a project that does not involve collaboration. And some of the aspects of a management plan include financial management. This is in part because all publicly provided funds are subject to strict financial management rules that are issued by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, and collaborators have to be on the same page regarding expenditures. It needs to be decided how money will be spent, how equipment will be purchased and used, and you even have to have consideration of how any purchases will be used even once the project is finished. So if a project is buying a laptop computer or a new piece of laboratory equipment, there needs to be some sort of management plan to decide that once the grant ends, who retains ownership and control of that piece of equipment. It's surprising how challenging this can be, particularly when you're doing multi-state, multi-institution, or even international collaborations. Just as an example, so I mentioned that I lead a training program that provides research ethics education in low and middle income countries in the Caribbean. And my collaborating site in Mexico is responsible for overseeing all of the Spanish language training. One of the things that they do is when they bring the students in, they always host a reception for both the students and the faculty involved, as well as several of the key administrators at the Autonomous University of Querétaro. It's a very nice event. However, some of the things that they do are they hire musicians for entertainment, they provide alcohol, and they also provide small gifts to the faculty and to the important administrators at the university. It turns out that all three of those things are actually forbidden expenditures under existing U.S. Funding policies, and so what I have to do is I have to communicate that to them, but I also have to figure out ways, recognizing that the cultural importance of those sorts of activities, of making sure that we can do them without violating U.S. funding requirements. And so sometimes that involves my paying out of pocket, and sometimes it involves my using other resources that Clarkson University gives me. Again, I've already mentioned training and supervision, but the management plan should also have some sort of consideration of appropriate training and supervision of collaborators and staff, and this can include some of the mandatory training for tasks like working with animals, hazardous substances, or human volunteers of research. So you have to have a plan for that training as well as appropriate supervision for anything that is regulatorily mandated and restricted. Management plans also establish the formal agreements regarding authorship, credit, and data ownership, and this is especially important for work done at different institutions. Because of this, when you're working with different institutions, having some sort of memorandum of understanding between the institutions regarding data ownership, materials transfer, and storage of resource data and materials, it's always best to have that agreed upon formally. And finally, you have this issue of regulatory compliance. When collaborating with another institution, responsibility for compliance may or may not extend to the other institution, and that other institution may or may not have regulatory expectations that differ from the expectations of your institution. Now, most large U.S. institutions and research centers, including Clarkson University, have systems in place to ensure compliance. We have our sponsored research office, but smaller institutions, and particularly institutions in other countries, may not actually have those. And so, really, collaboration, though very, very important, is very difficult to set up and run effectively. And there are a number of challenges of collaboration that arise and that are really explored and discussed in many of the assigned readings for this week, and will be some of the things that we'll analyze as part of the discussion forums and learning activities. But some of the challenges that I find are most common and have experienced myself are competing paradigms, including I do a lot of mixed methodology work, and sometimes there are disagreements between myself and my colleagues about whether to not use quantitative versus qualitative methods. We often operate in different knowledge domains, and so while that brings a wider diversity of experience and a wider diversity of perspectives, it also means that each of us comes with our own set of expectations and biases that are driven by our own fields of expertise, and sometimes those different knowledge domains can come in conflict. Perfect example is I was doing a small educational research project and setting up the data analysis part with my biostatistician colleague. She was insistent on a particular sort of set of data collection and analysis methods, but didn't understand that they were not only logistically impossible to meet, but they were actually regulatorily impossible to meet. She was asking me to collect personal data about students that under existing regulations I actually could not collect. And she didn't really understand the challenges that we faced, and was not initially willing to look at other data analysis methods that she considered to be less robust. And that was when it was important for us to have sort of this open communication and having a very trusting and collegial relationship. We may come in with different philosophical assumptions. I've already alluded a bit to that. There may be challenges of sharing equipment. Again, that's been alluded to, the idea of these formal arrangements to determine who will own the equipment and control access to it. But I have seen situations, collaborations between labs in a single institution where an important piece of equipment is located in one lab, and there's disagreements about who can use it and when they have access to it. Finally, obviously, there's all of these issues about data ownership, which are discussed in great detail in the readings assigned to you this week. And then finally, research credit, particularly authorship, as well as dissemination of the information. So all of these are sort of the types of questions that we're going to be exploring this week in the course. So I look forward to seeing you guys all online a little later. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye.